This story is titled, My Dad Made Me Pay for All My College Expenses. Now he brags about buying my little brother an apartment so he doesn't have to live with roommates. Now they are begging after I did this. Hey everyone! Before we jump into today's video, big news. I've launched a new Reddit channel. This time, the background isn't Minecraft. It's Subway Surfers in a Christmas theme to match the season. Check it out, subscribe, and join the fun. Links in the description. See you there. Now let's start the video. At 17, I was spending my weekends wiping down counters and making cappuccinos for customers at a cafe downtown. It wasn't the glamorous job I'd imagined, but it was mine. My parents, Greg and Susan, weren't thrilled about it though. To them, being a barista was a dead-end job, just a pit stop on the way to their real dream for me, law school. Greg was always going on about how lawyers were respected, how they had security, and how I'd be set for life. Susan backed him up with her favorite line, "Think of how proud we'd be, Leo. You'd make us the envy of everyone." It was never about what I wanted. It was always about them. They wanted to parade me around like some kind of trophy. Leo, the prestigious lawyer. The problem? I didn't even want to go to law school. I didn't dream of courtrooms or case law. I didn't care about debates or defending corporations. But in my family, what I wanted didn't matter. They saw my life as their personal project, and law school was the end goal. No ifs, ands, or buts. Meanwhile, my younger brother Caleb was living the dream, or rather my parents' dream of having a golden child. Caleb was 4 years younger than me, and somehow, he'd mastered the art of being their favorite without even trying. He didn't work, didn't stress, and somehow still managed to have everything handed to him. My parents would gush about how brilliant he was, even though his greatest accomplishment was convincing them to upgrade his phone every 6 months. It wasn't like I hated Caleb, at least not at first. He was my little brother, and I wanted to be supportive. But it was hard to ignore the favoritism. While I was juggling school and work, Caleb was living it up, coasting through high school without a care in the world. My parents bent over backward for him. When he struggled in math, they hired the best tutor in town. When he complained about his old car, they bought him a brand new Tesla Model 3. The Tesla, of course, became the centerpiece of their bragging rights. "Did you know Caleb is the youngest kid in his class to have a Tesla?" Susan would gush to her friends. "He's just so responsible." Responsible? Caleb didn't even know how to pump gas. Though I guess that didn't matter when your car ran on electricity. While all this was happening, I was scraping together whatever time and money I could to keep up with their demands for my future. Every time I'd come home from a long shift, Greg would remind me, "You've got to keep your grades up if you want a good law school to accept you." He acted like I had some kind of magical time machine that would let me work, study, and sleep all at once. It wasn't like I was slacking. I was pulling double shifts on the weekends and studying every night just to keep my GPA decent. But to them, anything less than perfection wasn't good enough. "Leo, you need to work harder," Susan would say as if I wasn't already running on fumes. "This is your future we're talking about." I'd nod, grit my teeth, and get back to it. What else could I do? Saying no wasn't an option. Not in my family. Disagreeing with Greg and Susan was like arguing with a brick wall. Pointless and exhausting. They'd just guilt-trip me into submission, reminding me how much they'd sacrificed for me to succeed. But the truth was, their sacrifices weren't for me. They were for their image. Greg loved telling his coworkers about how his son was destined for law school. Susan lived for the compliments she got from her friends about how driven I was. They weren't supporting me. They were investing in their own egos. At first, I thought maybe I could make it work. Maybe I'd get through undergrad, get into law school, and find a way to carve out my own life. But the deeper I got into it, the more I realized that this wasn't my dream. It was theirs. And the more they pushed, the more I started to push back in my own quiet way. I stopped volunteering for extra credit projects at school. I started taking fewer shifts at the cafe, even though it meant stretching my budget to the breaking point. Caleb, of course, noticed none of this. He was too busy living in his own little bubble of privilege. He'd come home complaining about how his Tesla's touchscreen was too slow, or how his private tutor didn't get his learning style. My parents would jump to fix every little issue, acting like Caleb was some kind of fragile prince who couldn't possibly be inconvenienced. And while they were busy catering to Caleb's every whim, I was practically invisible. If I had a problem, it was brushed aside. "You're older, Leo," Greg would say. "You need to figure things out on your own." It was frustrating, sure, but I kept telling myself that if I just held on a little longer, things would get better. I'd get through college, go to law school, and eventually earn enough money to move out and start fresh. I clung to that hope like a lifeline, even though deep down, I knew it wasn't realistic. The cracks were starting to show, but I didn't want to admit it. Not yet. So I kept my head down, grinding away at a future I didn't even want. And all the while, Caleb kept getting everything handed to him on a silver platter. I didn't hate him, not yet, but I could feel the resentment building, little by little, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Looking back, I wish I'd stood up for myself sooner, but at the time I couldn't see a way out. I was stuck in a cycle of obligation and guilt, trying to live up to expectations that were never mine to begin with. And the worst part? I wasn't even sure if I'd ever get the chance to break free. So one time after a long day, a full morning of classes, an afternoon shift at the cafe, and an evening spent at the library attempting to make sense of tort law, by the time I finally got home, I was ready to collapse. I just wanted to eat, shower, and maybe stare at my phone until I passed out. Instead, I walked straight into the middle of a full-blown celebration in the kitchen. Greg and Susan were practically glowing. Their smiles stretched so wide, I was surprised their faces hadn't cracked. Caleb was lounging at the kitchen table, looking smug as usual, while my mom was pouring glasses of sparkling water like we'd won the lottery. "What's going on?" I asked, setting my bag down and eyeing the scene with suspicion. Susan turned to me, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Oh, Leo, you're just in time. We've got some incredible news." I didn't even have time to guess before Greg jumped in. "We're giving Caleb a down payment for his dream apartment." He said it like it was the most casual thing in the world, as if this was just a standard milestone for every 18-year-old. I blinked. "Wait, what? A down payment? Isn't it amazing?" Susan gushed. "It's this gorgeous place downtown right near all the trendy spots. It's perfect for Caleb. Plenty of space, beautiful view, modern amenities. He deserves it after all his hard work." Caleb smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. "Yeah, it's nice or whatever. The kitchen's kind of small, though." Small? I couldn't believe my ears. "You're getting a luxury apartment, and you're complaining about the kitchen?" "Leo," Susan said sharply, her smile fading into a frown. "Don't start. This is a big moment for your brother. Be happy for him." Happy? I was barely keeping my head above water, working 2 jobs to scrape together enough for tuition, books, and gas, and Caleb was getting a down payment on a luxury apartment because he didn't like dorms. Greg, sensing my growing frustration, decided to chime in. "This is an investment, Leo. It's not just for Caleb. It's for the whole family. When he graduates and starts his career, this place will appreciate in value. It's smart planning." "Smart planning," I repeated, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "You're buying him an apartment because he doesn't want to live with roommates. That's not planning. That's spoiling him." Susan crossed her arms, her tone immediately defensive. "Leo, don't be so bitter. Caleb has worked hard for this. He's earned it." That made me laugh. Earned it? How? By going to class? By asking for a new phone every 6 months? By being your favorite? "Leo, that's enough," Greg said, his voice low and firm. "We're not going to turn this into a fight. Caleb deserves this, and it's not up for discussion." Caleb, who had been silent for most of this exchange, decided to pipe up. "It's not my fault they think I deserve it more," I snapped. "Of course you don't think it's your fault. You've never had to work for anything in your life. You wouldn't know hard work if it hit you in the face." "Leo," Susan's voice was sharp now, the kind of tone she reserved for when she thought I was out of line. "You need to stop this. Your brother has done nothing wrong, and you should be happy for him. Why can't you just support him?" Support him? I felt like I was in an alternate reality. "You want me to support him? Sure, I'll support him, just like you've supported me, right?" "Oh, wait, you haven't. Not once." Greg's face turned red. "We've done plenty for you, Leo. Don't act like we haven't given you opportunities." "Opportunities?" I repeated, practically shouting now. "What opportunities? Paying my own tuition? Working double shifts to afford books? Sleeping 5 hours a night because I'm too busy trying to juggle everything on my own?" "Yeah, thanks for all the opportunities, Dad." "You're being dramatic," Susan said, rolling her eyes. "Caleb's situation is different." "How is it different?" I shot back. "Because he's younger? Because he's your favorite? Because he doesn't have to lift a finger while I'm breaking my back every single day?" Greg stepped closer, his voice low and full of warning. "Don't talk to your mother like that. Caleb has goals. He's focused on school. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing. You should be taking notes." That did it. I slammed my hand down on the counter, making the glasses of sparkling water rattle. "You want me to take notes? Fine. Here's what I've learned. If you want anything in this family, you just have to be Caleb. That's the only lesson worth learning here." The room went silent. For a moment, nobody said anything. Caleb, of course, broke it with a dramatic sigh. "This is why nobody wants to hang out with you, Leo. You're so negative all the time." I glared at him. "Maybe it's because I don't have everything handed to me on a silver platter." Susan shook her head, looking at me like I was some kind of disappointment. I don't know what's gotten into you, Leo. You're acting so ungrateful. Ungrateful? I laughed bitterly. You're right. I should be grateful. Grateful that I'm the only one in this family who's expected to fend for themselves. Grateful that I'm working myself to death while Caleb gets handed everything on a whim. Yeah, I'm so grateful. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my bag and stormed upstairs. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding as I slammed my bedroom door shut. I could still hear them downstairs, their voices muffled but still full of excitement about Caleb's new place. For the rest of the night, I stayed in my room, trying to block out the sound of their celebration. Every now and then, I'd hear snippets of their conversation and calls with some family friends, Susan gushing about how the apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows, Greg bragging about how it was walking distance to all the best spots, and Caleb complaining that the second bedroom was a little small. I wanted to scream, to march downstairs and tell them exactly what I thought of their priorities, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They didn't care about what I thought or how I felt. They only cared about Caleb and their perfect little fantasy of a family. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. No matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I achieved, I would never be enough for them. They had made their choice, and it wasn't me. Caleb would always be their golden boy, and I would always be the one left behind. The following day, after I had just finished a grueling 8-hour shift at the cafe, I pulled into the driveway, and I knew something was up. Caleb's Tesla was parked at an odd angle, and I could hear shouting before I even stepped out of the car. I walked into the house to find Caleb pacing the living room, looking like someone had just run over his dog. Susan was sitting on the couch, wringing her hands, while Greg stood by the window, his arms crossed like some kind of grumpy detective. "What's going on?" I asked, dropping my bag by the door. Caleb spun around, his face flushed with frustration. "Someone scratched my car!" I raised an eyebrow. "Scratched? What do you mean scratched?" He pointed dramatically toward the driveway. "Go look for yourself." I sighed and headed back outside. Sure enough, there it was. A faint, barely noticeable scratch on the side of his car. It wasn't deep. Honestly, it looked like something you could buff out with a little effort. But from the way Caleb was acting, you'd think someone had keyed the word loser across the hood. "It's a scratch," I said when I came back inside. "The car still runs, doesn't it?" "That's not the point," Caleb shouted. "Do you know how much this is going to cost to fix?" I shrugged. "Nope, but I'm guessing it's not worth the meltdown you're having right now." "Leo, don't be rude," Susan snapped, standing up. "Your brother is upset and you're not helping." "Upset about what? That his fancy car has a tiny blemish?" I shot back. Greg, who had been quietly brooding by the window, finally spoke. "Leo, where were you this morning?" The question caught me off guard. "What? At work. Why?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Were you near Caleb's car at any point?" I blinked. Number. Why would I be near Caleb's car? Susan folded her arms and tilted her head in that way she always did when she thought she was being clever. "Well, you've been acting a little frustrated lately. Maybe you took it out on the car?" I laughed, but it came out sharp and bitter. "Are you serious? You think I scratched Caleb's car out of jealousy? That's ridiculous." "We're not accusing you," Greg said, though his tone said otherwise. "But it's not completely out of the question, is it?" Caleb, ever the opportunist, smirked. "I mean, it would make sense. Maybe you wanted to send a message?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Unbelievable," I muttered, shaking my head. "You're not helping yourself by being defensive," Greg added, his voice cold and measured. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Should I just confess to something I didn't do? Would that make you feel better?" "Leo," Susan warned, "you need to calm down." "Calm down," I snapped. "You're accusing me of vandalizing my brother's car with zero evidence, and you want me to calm down?" Greg stepped forward, his voice firm. "Nobody's accusing you of anything. We're just trying to figure out what happened." "Well, here's a thought," I said, glaring at all of them. "Maybe Caleb scratched it himself and doesn't want to admit it. Or maybe it was a random accident because, newsflash, cars get scratched sometimes." Caleb rolled his eyes. "Why would I scratch my own car? That doesn't even make sense." "Neither does accusing me," I fired back. "Enough!" Greg barked, his voice echoing through the room. "This isn't about you, Leo. Stop making everything about you." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, trust me, I know this isn't about me. Nothing ever is." With that, I grabbed my bag and headed upstairs, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I sat down on the edge of my bed. I couldn't believe them. Downstairs, I could hear them talking, their voices muffled but still loud enough to make out snippets of the conversation. "Maybe we shouldn't have brought it up," Susan said, sounding uncertain. "He needs to grow up," Greg replied. "This kind of behavior isn't acceptable." And you think I'm the immature one? I muttered under my breath. For the rest of the evening, I stayed in my room, trying to block out the sound of Caleb whining about his car and my parents reassuring him that everything would be fine. Every now and then, I'd catch a bit of Susan gushing about how Caleb's Tesla was a symbol of how far he's come. I wanted to scream. How could they be so blind? Caleb wasn't responsible. He was spoiled. He didn't even know how to handle the slightest inconvenience without throwing a tantrum. And instead of calling him out on it, they just enabled him. After the Tesla fiasco, things at home were tense to say the least. I could feel the weight of their eyes every time I entered a room, like they were waiting for me to confess to something I didn't do. Caleb, of course, was milking the situation for all it was worth. He made sure to loudly complain about the scratch whenever I was around, just to remind me, and anyone within earshot, that he was the victim. The air in the house was suffocating. Every conversation felt like a landmine waiting to explode, and I spent most of my time hiding in my room. But even that wasn't enough to escape the constant judgment. One evening, I was sitting at my desk when there was a knock at the door. Without waiting for an answer, Greg walked in, arms crossed. "We need to talk," he said in his usual no-nonsense tone. I sighed and set my book down. "What now?" Greg didn't waste any time. "Your professor called. He says you're not doing well in his class. Care to explain?" I rubbed my temples, already exhausted by the conversation. "I'm working full-time and trying to keep up with a full course load. It's a lot." "You knew this was going to be hard," Greg said, as if that somehow made everything easier. "If you want to get into law school, you need to take this seriously. No excuses." "No excuses?" I repeated, feeling my frustration bubble to the surface. "I'm doing everything I can, Dad. I'm working 2 jobs to pay for tuition because you won't help, and now you're telling me I'm not trying hard enough." "You're not," he said flatly. "If you were, your grades wouldn't be slipping." That was it. The last straw. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't get it, do you? You've never gotten it. I'm breaking my back to make this work, and all you care about is how it looks to your friends when I don't measure up." "Watch your tone," Greg warned, his voice low and dangerous. "No, you watch your tone," I shot back, finally letting all the pent-up anger out. "You want me to be some perfect little lawyer so you can brag about it, but you don't care what it's doing to me. You never have." At that moment, Susan appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Leo, what's going on? Why are you yelling at your father?" "Because he doesn't listen," I exclaimed. "None of you do. You're too busy worshiping Caleb to notice anything else." Susan frowned, her voice taking on that condescending tone I'd come to despise. "Leo, this isn't about Caleb. It's about you. You're not meeting your potential, and we're worried about you." "Worried about me?" I laughed bitterly. "No, you're worried about how I make you look." "It's not that we are comparing you," Susan insisted, even though that was exactly what they were doing. "Caleb is just more focused. You could learn a lot from him." "Of course I could," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Everything he does is perfect, and everything I do is a disappointment." "Leo," Greg said sharply, "you're being dramatic. You need to stop blaming Caleb for your problems," Susan said, her voice firm. "I'm not blaming Caleb," I snapped. "I'm blaming you. You're the ones who treat him like a king while I'm over here drowning. And the worst part? Your expectations from me exceed what you're willing to provide for me. Basically nothing." Greg's face turned red, and for a moment I thought he was going to explode. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "If you're so unhappy, maybe you should take a break and figure out what you really want." I stared at him, stunned. "Are you saying I should drop out?" "I'm saying you need to get your priorities straight," he replied. I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh you let out when you're so angry you don't know what else to do. "Fine," I said. "You want me to figure out what I want? Here's what I want. I want out." Susan's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done," I said, grabbing my bag. "I'm done trying to live up to your ridiculous expectations. I'm done killing myself for a dream that's not even mine. I'm done with all of it." "Leo, don't be ridiculous," Susan said, but there was panic in her voice now. "I'm not being ridiculous," I said firmly. "I'm finally doing something for me." Without waiting for a response, I walked past them and headed to my room. My hands were shaking as I packed a bag, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I knew if I stayed a second longer, I'd be sucked back into their world of guilt and obligation. When I was done, I left a note on the kitchen table. "I need space. Don't contact me." The night I left felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. I had no plan, no clear idea of what to do next, and nowhere to go. My phone buzzed a few times with missed calls from Susan, but I ignored them. I wasn't ready for another guilt trip. I just walked, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, until I found myself outside the cafe where I worked. Mark, one of my coworkers, was locking up for the night. He looked up and raised an eyebrow. Leo? What are you doing out here? You're not on shift, are you? No, I said, my voice flat. I just needed somewhere to go. Mark studied me for a moment, then nodded. You want to crash at my place? I blinked. Seriously? Yeah, man. I've got a couch. It's lumpy, but it beats wandering around all night. It wasn't exactly a 5-star offer, but I was in no position to be picky. Thanks, I said quietly. Mark's apartment was a small, cluttered space above a laundromat. The couch he'd mentioned was, in fact, incredibly lumpy, but it felt like a lifeline. That first night, as I lay there staring at the cracked ceiling, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. I didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time, I wasn't tied down by my parents' expectations. The next few weeks were a blur of survival. I picked up extra shifts at the cafe, trying to save enough for my own place. Mark was generous, letting me crash on his couch without asking for anything in return. But I knew I couldn't stay there forever. It was during one of those extra shifts that I ran into Aaron. We hadn't seen each other since high school, and he looked different, more confident, like someone who had figured out what they wanted in life. He ordered a black coffee, and when he recognized me behind the counter, his face lit up. Leo? Man, it's been forever. Yeah, no kidding, I said, handing him his coffee. How have you been? Good, he said, leaning on the counter. I'm doing graphic design and photography now. Freelance, mostly. What about you? I hesitated. Just working here and figuring things out. Aaron nodded like he understood, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. You ever think about doing something creative? I laughed. Me? Nah, I don't have an artistic bone in my body. You'd be surprised, he said with a grin. Why don't you come by one of my shoots sometime? See what it's all about. I wasn't sure if he was serious, but a part of me was intrigued. Sure, I said finally. Why not? A few days later, I met Aaron at a small studio he'd rented for a photo shoot. The space was cluttered with lights, backdrops, and props, and Aaron was moving around with an energy that was almost contagious. Here, he said, handing me a camera. Help me set up. I don't know anything about photography, I admitted, holding the camera like it might bite me. You'll learn, Aaron said, flashing a grin. Over the next few hours, I watched Aaron work. He had a way of making everything look effortless, whether he was adjusting the lighting or directing the models. I even tried taking a few shots myself, and while they weren't exactly masterpieces, Aaron didn't seem to mind. You've got a good eye, he said at one point, nodding at the camera. I laughed. I think you're just being nice. No, seriously, he insisted. You've got potential. If you're interested, I can teach you some basics. I hesitated. The idea of learning something new, something completely unrelated to law school or my parents' expectations, felt liberating. Yeah, I said finally. I'd like that. Over the next few weeks, Aaron became a sort of mentor. He taught me how to use Photoshop, how to frame a shot, how to work with clients. It was a steep learning curve, but for the first time in a long time, I felt excited about what I was doing. See, I told you you'd be good at this, Aaron said one afternoon, as we edited photos from a recent shoot. I'm not sure about good, I said, but I couldn't help smiling. You just need practice, he said. But you've got the passion. That's the hard part. Passion. It was a word I hadn't associated with myself in years. But Aaron was right. I was starting to feel it. Now, it has been months since I left my parents' house. I had completely reshaped my life. I'd gone from sleeping on Mark's lumpy couch to renting a small studio apartment, barely big enough to turn around in, but it was mine. I'd gone from making lattes and struggling to keep my head above water to freelancing with Aaron, juggling photography gigs and design projects. For the first time, I felt like I was finally in control of my own future. My parents, Greg and Susan, didn't see it that way. Their messages started trickling in a few weeks after I left, but when it became clear I wasn't going to respond, the trickle turned into a flood. At first, it was a mix of guilt-tripping and faux concern. Leo, we need to talk, Susan's voice rang out in one voicemail. You're making rash decisions. We need to talk. But their patience didn't last. Greg's tone grew sharper as the weeks went on. You're being unbelievably selfish, Leo. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? Then came Susan's masterpiece of dramatic guilt. Do you know how embarrassing this is for us? People are asking questions about you, and we don't even know what to say anymore. You've humiliated us. They weren't concerned about me. They were mad that I wasn't playing my assigned role anymore. Without me, the son they could brag about, their picture-perfect family narrative was falling apart. One night, I came home after a long day of editing photos and found my phone buzzing on the counter. It was Susan again. Against my better judgment, I answered. Leo! She snapped the moment I picked up. Finally! Do you have any idea how worried we've been? I leaned against the counter and sighed. What do you want, Mom? What do I want? She repeated, her voice rising. I want my son to stop acting like a selfish brat and come home. I blinked, stunned by her tone. You're calling me selfish? Yes, selfish, she spat. You walked out on this family without a word. Do you even realize what you've done to us? People are talking, Leo. They're asking questions, and your father and I are mortified. Mortified, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. That's what you care about? Not me, not how I'm doing, but how I make you look to your friends? Don't twist this around, Greg's voice cut in. He must have been sitting right next to her, waiting to jump in. This isn't about appearances. This is about you throwing your future away. You had everything lined up, a bright path ahead of you, and you ruined it because you couldn't handle a little hard work. I let out a bitter laugh. Hard work? You think I left because I couldn't handle hard work? I've been busting my ass for years, working jobs, paying for school, doing everything I could to live up to your impossible expectations. And for what? So you could ignore me while handing everything to Caleb? Leave your brother out of this, Greg barked. Caleb works hard and earns what he gets. I laughed again, this time louder. Earns it? He gets a down payment and a Tesla just for existing. Meanwhile, I was working double shifts just to afford my books. Yeah, sounds earned to me. Susan cut in, her voice sharp and condescending. Leo, this bitterness doesn't suit you. Caleb is focused. He has goals. You could learn a lot from him. I don't need to learn anything from Caleb, I snapped. What I've learned is that no matter how hard I work, no matter what I achieve, it'll never be enough for you. You've made that perfectly clear. You're acting like a child, Greg said, his voice full of anger now. Your brother is thriving, and you're over here throwing a tantrum because you're jealous. Jealous, I shot back. I'm not jealous. I'm disgusted. Disgusted that you can't see how blatantly you favored him his whole life. Disgusted that you've never once supported me the way you support him. And disgusted that you're still trying to gaslight me into thinking I'm the problem. Leo, how dare you speak to us that way, Susan said, her voice trembling with fury. Your father and I have done nothing but sacrifice for you, and this is how you repay us? You're an embarrassment. Greg's voice turned harsh and commanding. You need to fix this, Leo. You need to stop this ridiculous rebellion. Come home and go back to law school. This little experiment of yours is going to ruin your life. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. No, Dad, you're wrong. The only thing that was ruining my life was trying to meet your expectations. I'm not coming back. Not now, not ever. Susan's voice broke, though it was more anger than sadness. You're going to regret this, Leo. One day, you'll realize how much you've thrown away. And by then, it'll be too late. No, I said firmly. The only thing I'll regret is wasting so much of my life trying to please you. This conversation is over. Don't call me again. And then I hung up and blocked their numbers. For a few minutes, I just stood there, staring at the phone in my hand. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, but I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. Cutting ties with them wasn't easy. They were my parents, and some part of me had always hoped that one day they'd see me, really see me, for who I was. But that wasn't going to happen. Greg and Susan were too wrapped up in their own egos, too blinded by their favoritism toward Caleb, to ever truly understand or support me. In the days that followed, their absence was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. The constant judgment, the endless comparisons, the impossible expectations. They were all gone. One evening, as I sat in my tiny apartment editing photos, I realized something. I didn't miss them. Not Greg, not Susan, not Caleb. Cutting ties with them wasn't just about escaping their control. It was about choosing myself for the first time in my life. And for once, I wasn't afraid. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I was finally free to live life on my own terms, and that was more than enough.